Gentleman's game here. Have you ever been in a relationship or known a girl who at first seemed very sweet, gentle, feminine, all that stuff that we as men love in a woman, but then slowly over time, as you got to know her more and more, you realized that she wasn't who you originally thought she was? Or worse yet, maybe you slowly realized that this girl was either downright crazy, toxic, or neurotic? This is something that almost all guys who are experienced with women have gone through. So how can you recognize and avoid these kind of girls? Today I'm going to break down 4 specific archetypes of toxic women. If you recognize any of these tendencies or characteristics in a girl, I'm not saying you should instantly ignore her, but it definitely should raise a red flag. Before we start though, if you want my free 5-page PDF on the fundamentals of attraction, check out the link in the description box below. So the first type of girl you absolutely need to avoid is the overly insecure. You know that quote, "What's love got to do with it if you don't love yourself?" I think that's a quote that should be adhered to more. You see, everyone has 2 sources of love. Love that you receive from other people, aka your family, friends, your pet, your lover, etc. And then there's self-love, which comes from an inherent sense of self-worth, your self-esteem. Ideally, emotionally healthy people have both sources of love available to them. They receive love from other people, but they also love themselves. They know they're worthy of happiness. This is so important, especially to set boundaries, because if you don't love yourself, you'll likely let people walk all over you. Girls who are overly insecure lack the second source of love. They tend to have very low self-esteem. They don't think highly of themselves at all. They don't love themselves, and as a result, they need to double down on making sure they receive enough love from other people. And this is where it becomes problematic if you're with a girl who suffers from extreme insecurity as a result of a lack of self-love. Girls who fit this mold are gonna give you an array of problems. They tend to constantly think you're talking to other girls because subconsciously in her mind she's thinking, why wouldn't you? After all, she's not worthy. This will manifest itself as a myriad of problems in a relationship, whether constantly demanding to check your phone, accusing you of being just like all the other douchebags, or someone who doesn't really care about her after every argument. Dating an overly insecure girl is rarely worth it in my experience. Another tendency that most extremely insecure girls have is that they are very clingy. I remember one time I was dating a girl, Phoebe, who was a perfect example of this. I met this girl at a networking event, so she seemed level-headed and cool at the time, pretty cute as well. We hit it off great and I convinced her to let me take her out. She lived about an hour and a half or so drive away, so not really long distance, but we did have to go out of our way to meet up. The first date went great. The vibe between us felt good, she reacted well to my flirting, and we kissed by the end. But then that's when things started to get weird. She'd be texting me non-stop, and whenever I took more than half an hour or so to respond, she'd reply with some passive-aggressive text like, "Oh, never mind, looks like you're too busy for me," or something like that. After she added me on Instagram, she would casually bring up things like, "Oh, I see that you just liked this girl's picture. Don't you think that's kinda rude?" Things like that raised red flags, but I didn't think too much of it at the time since, in my mind, we weren't even dating. After 2 to 3 more dates, I recall another incident where she started to demand that I accompany her to do mundane things like grocery shopping or going to the gym with her. And again, I wouldn't have minded if we were actually a couple, but keep in mind this was a girl I had just met 1 month prior and lived almost 2 hours away. Long story short, I told her no, we got into an argument about me not quote-unquote putting in enough effort, and I had to block her from all my social media. Definitely learned a lesson that day to avoid overly clingy or insecure girls. The second type of girl you need to avoid is the emotional baggage carrier. Listen, we all have our own unique baggage, bad things that happen to us which might have negatively affected our psyche, but sometimes you run into a girl who has so much baggage that she's simply not in an emotionally healthy state of mind in order to be a good girlfriend. Maybe this girl was cheated on or had a bad relationship with her father, so she doesn't trust men, or her ex-boyfriend was abusive to her, so she has no idea how to establish boundaries or communicate with you in a healthy way. Whatever it is, you need to be able to identify and avoid women who carry around this excess emotional baggage. When you date a girl carrying around this baggage, it can feel like anything you do is wrong and bad. For example, if you disagree with her, that might trigger a memory of her abusive ex, and therefore she'll just shut down or get violent or angry. If you ignore her text once by accident, that might trigger another previous memory of abandonment, which she'll likely strongly overreact to. And the thing is, she's probably completely oblivious to how crazy she's coming off as, since it all makes sense through her narrative of being hurt before. Point is, in order for you to have a good relationship with a girl, you need to make sure that she's dealt with any issues first. And if you're noticing this girl bringing up the past and how X hurt her this way and how Y was such a dick, then that is a red flag that this girl has too much baggage and should be avoided. The third type of woman you need to avoid is the emotional manipulator. I think we've all known or dealt with someone who was an emotional manipulator at some point in our lives. But in case you haven't, let me paint a picture of a story about one of my buddies, Frank. He once dated this girl, Molly, that he met on some online dating app. When they first met, I could tell he was on cloud 9. After all, she seemed genuinely very sweet and cool. He'd bring her along to some of our hangouts, and she seemed like a perfectly normal girl, also with a sense of humor. 2 months into dating her, however, I noticed the honeymoon phase was quickly over. My friend was starting to act out a bit more around us, and he was withdrawing from our group of friends more and more, which was weird for someone with his cheery, outgoing personality. So I asked him what was going on. He told me he was already having some trouble in the relationship. I asked him to clarify, and he started telling me all these stories of her using different psychological warfare tactics in order to get her way in the relationship. For example, he told me that when he'd come home from work, tired from a long day slaving away at the office, he'd get a text from her demanding him to come over now that he was done with work. If he ever told her that he was tired or wanted to go to the gym instead, she'd freak out. She'd yell at him stuff like, "Oh, you think you had a tough day? Today I had to do yada yada yada." In other words, she had a real nasty habit of taking his problems, minimizing it to him like they weren't actual problems, right? Things that she could just easily dismiss. And then she would play up her own problems in order to guilt trip him and make him seem like a jerk. She'd also encourage him to share with her all his feelings and thoughts. And then later on, whenever they got into arguments, she'd bring up these insecurities or personal things about him to attack him. Like in an argument about something, she rubbed in his face the fact that he couldn't grow a beard, even though she knew he was insecure about it. Well, honestly, talking about it years later, it still ticks me off some of the things that she did to my bro. Eventually, she tried isolating him from his friends, us, so she could have him all to herself. We decided to give him an intervention. One night, I called his phone and said, "Dude, you gotta come over, it's an emergency." At my place were 5 of his buddies, and we all talked him over the course of 4 hours into breaking up with her. Thank goodness he listened and dumped that toxic, emotional manipulator. And finally, the fourth type of woman you need to avoid at all costs is the Karen. You've all heard this phrase recently. It's getting really popular online, especially with all these videos surfacing of different Karens around the world acting entitled and unreasonable. If by some chance you don't know what a Karen is, they're basically women who are rude, obnoxious, and entitled. When most people use the word Karen, they picture a middle-aged white woman, but in reality, every race or ethnicity has Karens. Basically, she's the type of woman who would call the cops on a 3rd grader selling lemonade on the street because she's disturbing the peace and doesn't have a license to do so. I feel like I don't really need to go much deeper and explain why you must avoid dating Karens at all cost. Seriously, just watch the hundreds of videos online of Karens threatening to sue someone for a minor misdemeanor, or cherishing her ability to make the life of retail workers a living hell by demanding to speak to the manager. When you date a Karen, there's a pretty high chance that you're gonna make a fool out of yourself. She'll probably cause a scene somewhere over some small perceived offense in some public venue for no reason, and everyone will be staring at you like, seriously bro, control your girl. Karens are also, by definition, very unhappy and defensive when things don't go their way, which will only make your life a living hell anytime you get into an argument with her. Seriously, I can already imagine the barrage of nagging and the shrill, high-pitched voice she'd use as a verbal weapon if she told you to do the dishes and you said no. Karens typically have a bad relationship with their husband since he's usually apologizing to whoever the victim of the Karen's antics are, all of which will probably lead to an expensive divorce. Long story short, the moment you start to notice some Karen-like behavior in a girl, I suggest avoiding her like the plague. So to summarize, the 4 women you absolutely need to avoid are the overly insecure, the emotional baggage carrier, the manipulator, and the Karen. Hope you enjoyed the video, guys. Something a little bit different than usual. Next week I got some special plans, so make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And as always, peace.